A visiting Pope's tale links Paris, Nairobi, and New York. Following Pope Francis' visit to Nairobi, I wondered, does he have the answer to radicalism, vulnerability, and exclusion? I lived in Paris as a student during the post-Tati department store attacks in the 1980s. I lived in New York and was in the subway on my way to work when the first of the Twin Towers came down. I was in Nairobi during the Westgate shopping mall attacks. Paris is my spiritual home, New York my intellectual center, and Nairobi is my heart. I thus have a great affinity to these cities and a high sensibility to terrorist attacks on these great cities. The New York Times recent article, entitled "Paris Slowly Coming to Terms with a New Vulnerability," made me go back and look at what Pope Francis had said on a just concluded trip to Nairobi. The Pope had gone to visit a place that I want to call his spiritual compass, Kangemi, an economically impoverished slum neighborhood. He delivered a no-holds-barred speech shared with the humble intellectual acuity that has so come to characterize his papacy. The similarities between the New York Times article and Pope Francis' speech were somewhat beguiling. Imagine this, a first world city with identical problems to a third world slum. It was as if the Pope had read the New York Times piece before writing his own speech, but since they were written on the same day, November 27th, it is highly unlikely, if not impossible. The New York Times article states, "There is another Paris, too, the Paris of the banlieue, the poor, heavily immigrant suburbs, many of them mostly Muslim and black. Clichy-sous-Bois remains one of the poorest towns in France, with unemployment around 40% and half the population under 25. Only 10 miles from central Paris, there's still no major road or mass transit station, despite a decade of promises, and it usually takes 90 minutes to commute each way. Here, there are not a lot of French like in Paris. Here, there are Arabs and blacks. Of course, many of the people here are French-born, but do not feel French in the same way as they imagine a white Roman Catholic does. They feel écarté or rejected. The suburbs are poor, Mr. Yaki, a resident, said. But what I like is the respect people show one another, and they help one another. This is something we don't see in Paris." I have excerpted the prior text from a larger New York Times article as it resonates with parts of the Pope's speech in Nairobi's Kangemi slum. The Pope begins with the positive aspects of slum people's living, stating, "The culture of poor neighborhoods steeped in this particular wisdom has very positive traits which can offer something to these times in which we live. It is expressed in values such as solidarity, giving one's life for others, preferring birth to death, finding a place for the sick in one's home, sharing bread with the hungry, for there's always room for one more seat at the table, showing patience and strength when faced with great adversity, and so on." When talking about the problems that the slum dwellers face, the Pope had this to say. "One very serious problem in this regard is the lack of access to infrastructure and basic services. This situation of indifference and hostility towards poor neighborhoods is aggravated when violence spreads and criminal organizations serving economic or political interests use children and young people as cannon fodder for their ruthless business affairs. These realities which I have just mentioned are not a random combination of unrelated problems. They are a consequence of new forms of colonialism, which would make African countries parts of a machine, cogs on a gigantic wheel, to legitimize the present model of distribution where minority believes that it has the right to consume in a way which can never be universalized." The Pope sees a way forward and continues his speech by saying, "In this regard, I would propose a renewed attention to the idea of respectful urban integration as opposed to elimination, paternalism, indifference, or mere containment. We need integrated cities which belong to everyone. We need to go beyond the mere proclamation of rights which are not respected in practice to implementing concrete and systematic initiatives capable of improving the overall living situation and planning new urban development of good quality for housing future generations. The social and environmental debt owed to the poor of cities can be paid by respecting their sacred right to the 3 Ls: land, lodging, labor. This is not a question of philanthropy. Rather, it is a duty incumbent upon all of us." So in looking at the New York Times discussion of the Paris banlieue, where the poor and marginalized are, and the pontiff's message in the Kangemi slum of Nairobi, I wondered if this is an overall message for the world, a world in which we see ourselves so different from the other, and yet need to respect the inherent dignity in each one of us. This may indeed be the solution to the hate, the anger, the destruction that manifests as radicalism, terrorism, and oddly enough, excessive consumerism.